And they talk about the garden was a way of making money look natural. Wealth, access to these gardens, whether they were access to the public or access to your friends, was a practice that formed the aesthetic gardens and differentiated it from economic horticulture. So in other words, they're not going to invite somebody to your rice garden, but or your rice fields. But when you start getting into garden making, it talks about sort of sharing this scholarly pursuit. And then it talks about he risked allowing access to those who would break the flowers and shout, and he risked ultimately providing an easily identifiable symbolic concentration of his wealth that would be wrecked relatively easily in a time of social unrest. And you think about, you know, the status of the West Hills or so forth. It's a show of status and wealth. And he says there is no resolution to this paradox. The late meeting garden was not a set of meetings, but a site of contested meetings, readable differentially as a pure space of aesthetics or as a luxury object par excellence, a battery of wealth. And I think that's a really interesting thing. In this respect, it's similar to the concept of luxury, which is also a paradox. And he goes on. But again, it's this Confucian Taoist sort of play, you know, that you spend all this money on rocks and trees in these gardens, but yet they were, you know, the guys, it talks about in Nicole's book that a trust fund son was criticized in the newspapers of the 1400s for spending too much money on rocks and trees. So yeah, you know, it's a great thing. And the same thing, you know, somebody like this would be a patron of the arts and commission a huge sculpture, and it'd be great to do for the city, but yet he's criticized for it as well. So there's always that duality in society, and you talk about, you know, elements of status. There's the Chinese threshold image. You still have to step up over this threshold in this house, and you know, some beautiful simplicity and amazing stuff in this simple building here, and obviously the thresholds of Beijing. Our beloved drip tiles, obviously, again, is also a status thing. Most of China was living at that time like this, where every drop of water meant something. They're, you know, draining every drop of water into a terraced field, but yet we enjoy you know, these drip tiles for what they do aesthetically. And what, you know, just, you know, one of my favorite times in the garden is when you're doing, you know, when you're watching these things here. And so again, you know, it's a status. It's not green. You know, but again, it's one of the most beloved things of the garden. So the status of the pavilion. For years, I talked about sort of this complexity matrix in the pavilion. And when the head designer was here in the garden, I finally got Jeff. I forget who was translating for me, but I asked him about this matrix of complexity in the garden, and you know, and I sort of came across to him as importance. Different pavilions were more important, and he came back with a really sort of interesting answer. He said that no one pavilion is more important because all of them are like an expression on a human's face. When a person has an expression, you can't leave out a mouth or eye or something. The all expression is important. And you know, you don't argue with the master, and you know, obviously the translation wasn't working very well. And so I think of the garden as more as a story, and when you do a story, you have introductions and beginnings and peaks and so forth. And it's very, very clear in the garden that there's a base matrix, which is say the Zhuan room, and the ultimate of the hierarchy is the Hall of Brocaded Clouds. And everything about all of those pavilions, you can talk about column bases, column capitals, the king and queen posts. The third bay, the way that the circulation bay is arched. You think about the Zhuan room, it's just a simple arch, and you look at the structure of the Hall of Brocaded Clouds, and it's this incredible slab beam. You talk about the height of the wainscots, the ginkgo screens. Think of the Namu paneling in the Zhuan room, perfectly flat and smooth, up to the Hall of Brocaded Clouds, which is that book mirror, same carving on the other side of the door. And obviously, when you look at roof shapes themselves, you just look at this diagram from that book, and it's so easily read by everybody, and cross-culturally about the status of that pavilion versus that, right? And so you have rafter extensions, roof shapes, Singular versus additive roofs, singular versus additive roofs, and ridges. Again, look at the ridges on the Zhuan room versus hollow brocaded clouds. When you get into the detail of architecture, you start looking up at a piece of architecture in China, and again, too many notes, but really it comes down to some really simple concepts. There's the Lu Tu, the Daogong, and the Ang. Okay, and basically that's the concept. That's it. And once you think about it, it's simple. It's not all that hard to deal with it. Again, the Lu Tu is the base, and again, pardon my pronunciation, is the Ang, and the Lu, and then the Haokong, and the two bracket. And what is this bracket? What is this little element that is the basis of most Chinese architecture? Basically, it's like our Lincoln logs. And most of us have probably played with Lincoln logs. You just think about back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and you can create columns and look at the way they got a little cantilever roof and so forth. That's it. You just do it, and it's just back and forth and back and forth. Again, from that book that Dennis showed, this is the section they use as the typical section. Anybody recognize this section? Our pavilions. This is the structure of the hollow brocaded clouds. This is the same beams and structure type and even the column bases. They got this right. See the flattened lotus column bases versus the granite balls. But you look at the status of this section versus this goes back to the simplicity of the Zhuan room. Again, it's the same section. The Zhuan room has, these sort of squished posts in the trusses. It was too hard to model those. But you look at that and you turn that into a space. And in the tours, it's easier to talk about a 7-column hall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But really what it is, because these columns, you don't always see them, the book talks about a 7-purlin hall. And purlins, again, it's a sort of more of an architectural term, are these major beams that run this way in a building. Those are purlins. Same thing. So the status of the section. In Chinese architecture, you have the 3, 5, 7, and 9 status hall. And so again, 3, 5, 7, and 9 status hall. And what you do is, if you start thinking about the 3-column hall, you have a main space and a circulation space outside. You get a 5-column hall, you can get a secondary room in there if you build it, and the circulation. 7-column hall, you look at you're getting the variations that you can create in that 7-column hall. The main thing that our garden is this diagram right here. The pink is the circulation, the main space, and a secondary space right there. And the 9-column hall, you look at the variations. The pink is the circulation on the 9-column hall. The blue is the secondary rooms that you can create off of here. And the green is the main hall. You can come down to a gray hall, so forth. And so, what does that really mean? So you have the 3-column hall, and you go to this Lu Man Sing from 50C BC. And it talks about, and when you look, this again, 507 BC. When you read these, think about who they're talking to and the desires of the status of the people that they're talking to. Whenever this little house is built, it may not be too high, and it talks about the size that it should be. But the most important thing is it talks about whoever builds a house with 3 purlins, Obiang's rule must look for favorable measurements of width and height, and if these are favorable dimensions, in the future many good sons will be brought forth. Okay, so that's the desires that they're talking about of achieving in a 3-column hall. You go to a 5-column hall, and again, you start getting the variation of the secondary zone in here built out, and the circulation space over here, and it talks about it can be a little bit higher and a little bit more complex. But again, look at the desires and the status. A house with 5 purlins and 3 bays is especially outstanding if the timber is measured according to the white inch. Profit is a certain thing. Profit, all of a sudden, commerce comes in. Life in it will be peaceful with abundance of luck, and sudden wealth will enter the house time and again. So you're talking about, think about the Levittown in New Jersey and the status of the middle class of the United States. And that's what they're talking about here, bringing wealth in. So you get 7-column hall, you get, the complexity. Again, here's our diagram. You could have a full hall here. You could have circulation on both sides, but it's typically not always done, but there is an instance in the garden. And look at who they're talking to here. The construction of this house, again, this is 507 BC. The construction of this house with this magnificent hall depends entirely on the clever planning of the craftsman. Wealth and rank are the result of proper measurement, but yin and yang must be taken into consideration. So wealth and rank starts coming into play. And then you get the 9-column hall, these secondary rooms. This was essentially for the emperor. The construction will work in advance again. You get the complexity of the sizes. In the 9 spheres of the hall with 9 purlins and 5 bays, there will be perpetual luck for 1,000 and 10,000 years. Careful adherence to the true measures of our patron saint will bring forth wealth and rank. Ample farmland as well. If the people of the present age do not obey the method of the immortal master, disharmony between the houses and its occupants will be the result. So again, very, very interesting status, feng shui, and the complexity that you can get by framing. If you're following these in terms of walling these different simple 9-column hall, you can get all these wonderful different kinds of spaces with that formal thing. So I diagrammed the garden really quick. This isn't specific or exact, but you get the idea. Zhuan room, the main hall, the secondary space, and the circulation space. This one, obviously, it isn't circulation, but it's the same thing in the 3-part bay, and even this little entrance thing, the gift shop. The hall brocaded clouds is a very interesting one because it has circulation on 3 sides. That 3rd bay wraps around, and then it's built inside. You can see the dark green on the back side here. The scholar study has a secondary small version in the circulation, and the other big exception is the tea house, the Tower Cosmic Reflections. It has a 3-bay system, and then they violate it again by popping out. And so, one of the most dynamic feature of following that bay system is the upturned roofs. Let me go back again. And these upturned roofs are one of the great things that we think about and are as a symbol of Chinese architecture. Oops. And one of the previous lectures here, somebody talked about these eaves and these corners as swallowtails, and I have looked. And if you guys can find a reference to swallowtail, it's always a great discussion. I can't find references to swallowtail, but some people call them that. I like to think of them as batwing because most of you know bat and fu and is also happiness. Somebody Peggy, you had to.
Oh, I was just thinking that when a bat flies, his wings would look like that.
Yeah, and it's a great reference to the batwing. And the whole fu and happiness and upliftedness. This is the master of the fishnets garden here. And bats are in the garden everywhere. So I like to think of them as batwing. Remember we were talking about the chi energy coming down from Earth. The upsweep deflects that negative energy back up. In practical terms, when you read and research this topic of upturned roofs, you always hear about the overhangs provide shelter. It protects that timber, which rots out very easily from water, but yet it lets light in because by lifting up, you let the light deeper into the building. So it makes sense, but really what it's doing is an upliftedness, both the happiness and visual weight. And visual weight is really one of the things that started driving the shapes of Chinese architecture. If you look around Portland, I stepped out of my house, we live in the Buckman neighborhood, and you look at why are the houses in Buckman better or different than something that's built by a builder in today's world is because little things like every one of the roofs on this house, this is our house, they went to the hassle of here's the rafter that comes down to here. They built a little plate, and then they built another piece of stick from here out. Even on this simple house here, here's the rafter coming down here. They broke it off. They put another rafter out here to create that overhang. Just that little bit of a swoop, right, is what a house from 1902 did when they had labor and could spend the time that a builder in today's world doesn't do, and it makes all the difference in the world. the roofs in a 2001 house is not going to look as good, or it just feels wrong. And that is one of the reasons why. And I don't know for sure, but a builder would probably charge you, 40, 50, 60,000 bucks to do that now in today's world. You look at probably one of the most perfect examples of Western architecture, the Parthenon. And in Nashville, they rebuilt the Parthenon. I remember seeing this when I was about 10 years old, and it was really spectacular. But you look at that picture, and you look at that picture, and there's something different. It's wrong. And what it is the Parthenon. This is an exaggerated diagram of the Parthenon. There's very subtle curves in here and in here. And this, again, is exaggerated. These columns are done in perspective, and by doing those little subtle curves, all of a sudden it feels right. There's a little bit of a weightlessness given by the angles of those columns. Same thing, the Green and Greens, wonderful architects in California. They did everything they could with wonderful beaming and rafters to make very, very heavy houses seem more uplifting and light. And obviously, going back to Falling Water, just an absolute amazing technical effort to cantilever this incredible mass to make it seem weightless. But you go back to Chinese architecture, and what were they doing? They were, this huge, huge building, incredible mass. But there's all kinds of upliftedness in here. Obviously, the brackets on the ridge, bring your eye up. The incredible curves in here, the upliftedness of these corner elements. Again, they sort of step out. In detail, the early halls in China, these columns were slightly higher than these columns. And I think in this hall that is the case. You can see it's subtle, but it's there. And it gives you that little bit of extra weightlessness. And it turns this hall into something graceful, which obviously, if you straighten these things out, and you take away some of these techniques, you would have one heavy, heavy building.
How many columns were there?
That one, I've tried to decipher it, and there's these really complex. It's based on the 9, but it's complex to dissect it. And it was one of the things I was going to do here, and that's the difference between a scholar and a generalist. Right? It was one of the things I wanted to do is dive into the Forbidden City and pull out those 9-column halls in the courtyards. But it's going to take some work. But the Dao Gong is the general term for this assemblage around here. Dao from the Lu Dao and the Hao Gong, which is this bracket, is all compression. And that's the important thing. Everything is compression. So let's look at the architecture of compression. You could stand on that little bit of Lincoln log stuff, right? And it's gonna hold you up. You put a little bit of sideways force on it, it's gone. Architecture of compression. Obviously the pyramids, the Romans were the first to do this. But the viaducts were important because they were a series of arches that were sort of holding each other up all the way until you get to the mountain 2 miles away. But there's a limit to what you can do with that arch. And you take that arch into the future, and probably one of the most amazing modern architects that doesn't get enough credit is Louis Kahn. And Louis Kahn understood compression, and he understood arches, and this is in India. Again, I showed you the Exeter Library, but this is all compression. This is what a brick can do. One of his famous quotes is, "I look at a brick, and what does the brick tell me? The brick wants to be an arch." Right? And so,
What kind of building is that?
He understood it better than anybody. And
What is that? What kind of building is that?
that's a government building, near Mana job or something like that. I haven't been to India, but if you go to India, the Louis Kahn stuff is probably one of the great pilgrimages an architect can do. And he actually died in the Madison Square Garden by himself, coming back from India. And his body wasn't identified for 3 days because he looked like a vagabond. He had come back from India, from his Bangladesh capital. And going back to Frankie, and one of Frank Lloyd Wright's less talked about masterpieces is these textile block, and it has to do with compression, and he hid tension inside. So of course Frankie does both. But some of his greatest work was in Los Angeles on these textile block houses, and he used a little bit of it in Japan as well. But you look at these spaces that were done in compression with this repeating textile block. But when we talk about compression in the garden, what are we talking about? When a roof is loaded like this, it wants to fall. And when this movement comes, you're talking about that thrust force creates tension on this bottom chord. And what is tension? You know, tension really wasn't handled in architecture until modern times when you could do something like this. Nails and cables and so forth. You know, obviously it happened a little bit earlier than this. But here's a structure of tension, and this is the general concept. When you use wood pegs and wood bracket systems, you can't really do this very well, right? And so Chinese architecture is all about doing that. Going back to probably the greatest architect, singular architect of all time, Antonio Gaudi in Barcelona, he dealt with this idea of compression wanting to move things outward in a different way than anybody ever handled it before. This is the turn of the century, 1900s, and he did analysis, and this is one of the things that drove me crazy. There's a fantastic diagram that he used to work out these columns, and I know it's in a book somewhere, and it drove me nuts. I probably spent 8 hours looking for that diagram, and it's somewhere. But it's one of the most beautiful graphic things you could possibly find in terms of the thrust